tonight is not the first, it's the second Wednesday, but we're treating it like it's the first because Brother Charlie was ready to give his lesson last week, and it spent considerable time on it. And so we thought it'd be wise just to switch and tonight have our abbreviated classes first, and then the singing, prayer, reading, and the lesson second. In our readings, we are in Jeremiah now. We are Jeremiah 1 through 13. I want to just give an overview of the book. Jeremiah is writing, could you tell me in a nutshell when, Kirsten?
627.
I'm sorry?
627.
Yeah, that's good. What's going on during that time, Patty? What's going on with the people of God?
They're horribly idolatrous, and he's preparing them for Babylon's going to come.
Exactly right. And so we've got that time. I think Kirsten's right on at 627, 628. And he goes, actually, he prophesies on into the event itself, the captivity. And in fact, he's taken himself, Jeremiah's taken where?
Toward Egypt.
Toward Egypt, that's right. And so it's interesting in using a map in your mind, let Babylon be over here, Assyria up here, the Fertile Crescent, and then land of Canaan is over here. And so during this time now, we've got Jeremiah in Jerusalem, Daniel over in Babylon, Ezekiel on the river Kibar, and then who am I leaving out? Jeremiah. Well, I've already said that. Jeremiah in Jerusalem, Ezekiel and Daniel. So you have where God's people are, God's spokesman, his prophets to them. All right, and so in Jeremiah, the first, it has 52 chapters. It's a fairly long book. The first 45 chapters have reference to prophecies to Judah and why they should basically capitulate, give in to the Babylonians, and your houses, the temple itself will be spared. But false prophets were coming in among them and saying, "Oh no, Jeremiah's all washed out." That's not the case. We've got allies and other people, Egypt, and so they were telling people. And then we find in the earlier chapters they had confidence in themselves, they confidence in their idolatry. They could not even blush, wouldn't even blush. That they had become so ingrained, the sins that they were committing were so ingrained that they had no consciousness about them. Kind of like people today in our society. Doesn't bother them to kill somebody, steal, murder an innocent baby still in the womb. Has no compunction of conscience whatsoever. Have no regard of God. They don't know who God is, and really they don't know who they themselves are. And that's pretty much how the Jews had gotten to be by the time Jeremiah prophesies. So he speaks concerning Judah in 1 through 45. In 46 through 51, it's a prophecy against the Gentile nations surrounding them. It's almost a refrain in the prophets. He condemns Judah and Israel, but he doesn't let the Gentiles, whether they be Ammon or Moab or any of the others, get by scot-free. They have their problems. So 46 through 51 deals with prophecies against the Gentiles, and then 52 is actually another description of the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah is called in chapter 1, and he's commissioned to go to the people. In chapter 2, what do we find there?
Tell them what Israel's been doing.
Yes, he is. He identifies some of their sins. In fact, the American Standard has their backsliding unexampled. They were just so terrible in what they were doing. 32 of chapter 2 is a commonly remembered passage. Can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire. Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. In other words, things that you remember like the back of your hand. These things that were so important to me at that time in my life that you never forget. And yet my people have they have no clue as to who I am. In chapter 3, verse 1, he says, middle part of the verse, you've played the what? Harlot. And that again, though immorality, fornication was certainly rampant, but that harlot with many lovers would just be another term for what? Idolatry. Yes, idolatry. And 3, I have used this passage a lot, 3, 6 through 10. Those are great, great passages to give a Bible principle that really is throughout. He mentions that, who is king at this time? Josiah. Josiah is a good king. And Josiah had all those reforms, you remember. And so here's Judah. Josiah rises above the ordinary. He's way up here. And but when you read what happens in the Chronicles and the Kings, it just seems like things are going like gangbusters. Josiah's turning things around. But then Jeremiah deals more with the people, and they didn't learn from Israel, verse 8. He had put Israel away, given her a bill of divorcement, basically just put her away because of her idolatry. And verse 9, it came to pass through the lightness of her whoredom that the land was polluted, and she committed adultery with stones and stocks. And yet for all this, her treacherous sister Judah hath not returned unto me with her whole heart, but feignedly, saith the Lord. Just pretending. And that is so sad that Josiah, great, great leader, he's up here. But the people are basically going through the motions. Well, that's Josiah. We'll go through if we have to. But the people did not do so with their whole heart. And so basically the reforms, though they were carried out well by Josiah, the people's hearts were not actually in it. And if you got a good leader over here, and this is what we need to do, this is why we need to do it, this is God's way, and a few get on board, but the majority still just, I'm not interested, thanks, but count me out. What's it going to do overall once the leader dies? It's going to go right back to where it was, exactly. And that's what we find with Josiah. Let's see. In 4, Judah is threatened with invasion from Babylon. In chapter 5, we just kind of go through quickly. Their godlessness is emphasized. You see that even in a marginal and a topical reading of the American Standard. Their guilt, the threat of their being taken is again mentioned in chapter 6. And 6:14 is a great passage that pictures the false teachers. The false teachers were saying, oh, it's okay. You're all right. Don't worry about what you're doing. They have healed also the hurt of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace. It's okay, when truly there is no peace. And verse 15, were they ashamed when they committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they shall fall among them that fall at the time. And then our passage we've used in our Sunday night lesson 16, you just examine. Look around and see where you are. And what you need to do is ask for the old paths. Where's the good way? Is blushing an ability for animals? That's just my question. I'll just give you the answer. No. Yeah, you good answer. Now, that's another thing but because blushing has to do with the raising of the heart rate, raising of blood pressure, making our face kind of red, and it does that when we have a consciousness of the fact that we have done something wrong, or something has been exposed about us that's not right. Well, animals have no sense of that. Another sense in which we are made in the image of God after His likeness. 7 is interesting. They thought that the externals would just take care of them. We've mentioned this in lessons. He says in verse 3, amend your ways and your doings, and I will cause you to dwell in this place. But don't trust in lying words, that is, from these false prophets who say, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. In other words, as long as we have the temple, what? We're all right. We live like we want. There's no problem. And then he gives a listing that's very similar to Isaiah as well as Hosea, insofar as just a listing, like a laundry list of their sins. If you oppress not the sojourner, verse 6, the fatherless, the widow, shed not innocent blood, walk after other gods. Then will I cause you to dwell in this place, and so on. But then murder, lying, they lied, commit adultery, verse 9, swear falsely, burn incense. In other words, you take all the 10 commandments and just check. They were guilty of every one of them, violating them. And so we have that in 7. In 8, how shameless they were. In 9, again, there's no truth among them. Their ruin is certain. In 10, their false gods are contrasted to Jehovah God. And then in 11, their breach that they had made. Oh, by the way, Jeremiah begins to discuss the covenant that they had a whole lot more than other prophets. And the first covenant, and of course in 31 he says that God will make a new covenant with the house of Judah and with the house of Israel. All right, and then in 12, Jeremiah's question about their demise, and then God's answer. And then finally in 13, we find some types of parables, if you please, the linen girdle, and how it's marred, and how that describes really Judah. Comment, question, anybody? Anyone? All right. Let's move on. I wanted us to do several things insofar as our class tonight. I say several. I wanted to show you some pictures of the Garden of Gethsemane, and let's go. We're on page 99 of our workbook, and we're in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of Jesus and the apostles having left the upper room, and they're going to the garden where Jesus. There are 11 of them. Why aren't there 12? Judas is gone. He's been conspiring with the others. So there are 11, and he takes the 11 toward this Garden of Gethsemane, where he has been, it's been his custom to go to retire from the crowds to pray. And then he separates Peter, James, and John from the other 8, and they go, and then he says, you sit here and wait and pray and watch. And then he went about a stone's throw. Depends on what, doesn't it depend on how large the stone and how strong the man? But what kind of used to I could throw a rock for a long way when my arm was nice and limber. Most say 150 to 200 feet. Well, 150 feet, so half a football field, that's 50 yards. That's a pretty good throw. But anyway, about that far, if you could imagine. And then Jesus kneels down and prays to the Father, let this cup pass from me. Let's go through just a few things. Here we are, the last. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
They could see him. He wasn't so far away that they couldn't see him.
Possibly, yeah, possibly. I wouldn't say for sure. We don't have. Well, when you said when he said watch, is that where you were going? Yeah, could be watch, like watch for sins and temptations. Last day with the disciples, and here's where we are in this the last Thursday. We're just about to his betrayal, his arrest, but now he leaves the upper room, goes to Gethsemane, between the Kidron, or the brook Kidron, and the Mount of Olives, where in great agony he prays. This is just a picture, or a map rather, here is the Temple Mount. Here's the wall around the city. We want to keep in mind that the Kidron Valley, here you have it marked, the Kidron Valley goes through up here. The Mount, so in other words, it goes down, and you've got the valley, and then it comes up, and then you have the Mount of Olives. And the area that we're talking about is somewhere in here. This mount marks Gethsemane as almost due east of the Eastern Gate. By the way, this is in this artist's conception and mount. Here we have the Wailing Wall. The western wall would be over here, and then we have the temple, and then the eastern gate that would go out of the wall down the Kidron would have been right here, and they lined it up around about right there. Okay, let's do some reading, and we'll come back and we'll show some pictures that I took when we were over there several years ago. Let's just read. Patty, if you would, Matthew 26, 36 through 46. Now, you'll notice on the top of page 99, I mentioned Matthew 26, 30, then 36 through 46. 30 is where, right after the institution of the Lord's Supper, they do what? They sang a hymn and went out. And likely that would have been Psalm 118, or at least 115 through 118. Those were the Hallel or Hallelujah Psalms. And 118 was right there at the end of the Passover. That's not in the Bible, but it's according to all the reliable Jewish traditions. If that's the case, then the stone which the builders rejected, the same was made the head of the corner. Y'all remember that, Pat? That's 118. This is the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Save, Lord, we pray. All those passages were so familiar, heard Jesus quote. That's Psalm 118. And so if they were singing this, there again, it almost makes my skin crawl to think here are the passages Jesus has been using during his ministry, and they've been showing how God has been good to Israel, but Israel has rejected God's final deliverer, and here he is, and he's singing with the disciples, if that's the case. So they sang a hymn and went out. Patty, Matthew 26, 36 through 46.
Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray unto them." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away again, and he prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
Okay, and it's interesting in the very next verse, while he yet spoke, lo, Judas, one of the 12, comes. While it's as if he's just still in sentence, and you hear, the rustling of the weeds and whatnot, and they're coming to get him. All right, several things here. We'll show them out. The word Gethsemane is actually, most think it's an Aramaic word that was just brought in. And all it means is oil press, an oil press. It was not really a proper name. Now, we call it the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's capitalized. in our translations. But that was one thing that kind of surprised me. All the reading, the reading I'd done before I went over to Israel, but that was really impressed on us when we were there, that there were a lot of Gethsemanes, that anywhere there were olive trees and there was a press, and that would be an oil press, a Gethsemane. But this was evidently a specific one right outside the wall in the valley, right as you began to ascend up the Mount of Olives. So he's there, and he says, "Sit while I go yonder and pray." He takes Peter, James, and John, and then I want you to notice something that I've not emphasized, I don't think, as much as I probably should have. But in verse 37, he began to be sorrowful and sore troubled. Verse 38, then saith he unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. What do your translations have on unto death? What is that?
Point of death.
To the point of death, yes, to the point of death. I don't think very many of us have really emphasized this. A person can be so distraught and overcome, well, sometimes when people give bad news, and I mean, it just floors them. We have it during the days, you remember, of Samuel, that somebody gets bad news, they can just die of a heart attack. That the system will go into all kinds of overload, and here he was sorrowing even toward death. That this just got him so far down. Remember Isaiah 53, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and one before men would hide their eyes from. And so he's acquainted, he's a man, a sorrowful, and all of this was leading to the point of almost death. And then he says in verse 39, he went, Matthew records, he went forward a little and fell on his face and prayed. Luke says first in Luke 22 that he went forward and then he knelt down. I get the picture, if I put it all together, Matthew and Mark both say that he fell on his face, Luke that he knelt, that he likely went and he began by kneeling, and then he was so overcome with sorrow and the whole weight of everything that he was about to do, that he just put his head down to the ground. And I think some of us may have done that before. And when things are so bad, it's just like, what in the world can I do about this situation? And you're just so overcome, prostrate with grief, and that's where he was. Brother McGarvey makes the point, I quote him here in the notes, that it looks like that from this point on, that his humanity is in the ascendancy. I was telling some fellows the other night that we want to emphasize the deity of Jesus, rightly so, but we don't want to emphasize that to the degree that we forget what the Bible says about his humanity. That he was in all points tempted like as we, yet without sin. Everything about Jesus was human. Now he was still divine, deity, but we don't want to forget that what he endured. I think when I was younger, I thought, well, Jesus is kind of like Superman. These things just don't faze him like they faze me. Well, that's not true. He had feelings. He hurt. He had sorrow. Even he had compassion. You remember when Lazarus was dead and he saw Mary and Martha so upset, his friends, y'all have the people that you love so much and they're so distraught, something so terrible happens, it makes you cry too. In John 11, I think it's verse 35, and Jesus wept. And so all of these things that are a part of the human experience, except for sin, Jesus experienced. We don't want to overlook those ideas because it brings to life to me that how terrible sin is, and how he becomes our tremendously great high priest. That passage in Hebrews 4, we have not a high priest that cannot be touched. Double negatives there, emphasizing the positive nature of it. We do not have a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but one that hath been in all points tempted like as we, yet without sin. So we can appreciate those passages from this. Let's turn over to Mark real quickly before our time runs out. Mark 14. And in Mark 14, down in verses 32 through 42, we have pretty much the same information. Sons of Zebedee are identified, and then Peter, James, and John. Peter and then the sons of Zebedee are mentioned here in verse 33, James and John. He mentions that, he goes away, remove this cup from me, that I'm looking at down in verse 36. Father, all things are possible unto thee. Remove this cup from me, howbeit not what I will, but what thou wilt. If the Father had removed this cup, this intense suffering that he had to undergo in his death, what would have happened to the whole scheme of redemption? That's exactly right. And so he could have, but he didn't. God's love, Christ's love. I think we mentioned, I can't remember if it was Monday night or to some guys or last Sunday where I said this, but he dreaded what he had to undergo just like we would. Who for the joy, Hebrews 12, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame. Despising shame. He didn't like it. He despised the shame that was associated with all this. But who for the joy that, seeing that what it would accomplish for him to do that, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and then has sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. Let's turn to Luke 22 real quickly. Luke 22. We're not reading all these. I trust you already have. In Luke 22, in verse 39, beginning, he came out and went as his custom was. Now, that's a little phrase where you can link that back to Judas. Judas conspired with these fellas because he knew where his custom was, that he would go out and in a reclusive place and pray. And when he was there, he said, verse 40, pray that ye enter not into temptation. That's what I had reference to a while ago, Brother Charlie, about watching, But you could be right. The same words used. And he was parted from them about a stone's cast, and he kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine. And there appeared unto him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. We don't learn that in Matthew and Mark. And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became, as it were, great drops of blood falling down upon the ground. That Luke is the only one that mentions that. And when he rose up from his prayer, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow, and said, Why sleep ye? Rise and pray that ye enter not into temptation. They were sleeping for sorrow, the American Standard. Some of the newer translations say from sorrow. And the idea is they were just so burdened down themselves. It had been a long day. They were anxious. What's going to happen? That they couldn't stay awake. Have we been like that, where the eyes are heavy? It's like, ooh, just just try to push them up. They're so heavy they just about won't stay open. And Jesus, on occasion when he comes and finds them, he understands what's going on. He says the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So he understood, they wanted to. It wasn't the case that they were rebelling. It was just, they just physically been exhausted. Yes,
I
ma'am.
have a quick question. In the middle of my margin of my Bible, it says,
Where are we? What passage you talking about?
43 and 44.
Oh, okay.
It says 43 and 44 as not in the original text.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Why
Yeah.
does it say that?
Because there are some manuscripts that don't have it. Some do. That just like John 8, 1 through about 10 or 11, Acts 8:37. There are passages that will be disputed passages because in some manuscripts that have been found, it's lacking, but then in others it's there. And so I think to the credit of the translators, they say that this is a questionable text in some places. Most of the time, you remember, Kirsten, when we were studying how we got the Bible by Lightfoot, most of the time that context will determine if it fits or if it doesn't fit. Also, there are some occasions where in the life of Jesus that there will be a questionable, like wisdom is justified of his children. That's a passage that's questioned. But then it's mentioned in a parallel account. So even if it's questioned in one, but it's mentioned with no doubts about it, it's obvious Jesus would have said it. And I think that's how to look at that. If you like, sometimes you look at it, when you see it in your Bibles, some ancient manuscripts omit this. When it says some, that means though that there are many that don't. They do include it. And so you kind of think about that. Okay, great question. Anybody else?
Think about him in the garden, and he's talking about him weeping and crying. He knows what's fixing to happen, what the pain and agony he's got to go through. But I think he also thinking about his disciples, his apostles. He told them, said, "You love me like I love you."
Yes.
Now he's fixing; they're gonna be left alone to try to carry out this work.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, you made me think if I had a question, I don't think I do. Didn't remember it. There's a passage in Hebrews 5 that speaks of a comparison between Christ and the high priest of the Old Testament. And I think it's verse 6 or 7, who in the days, speaking of Christ, who in the days of his flesh, having offered up prayers and supplication with strong crying unto him who was able to save him from death, and having been heard for his godly fear, though he was a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. The strong crying and tears that Hebrews 5 mentions, we don't find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John. And so you can just, when you fill out, just a second, David, when you fill out that picture, you've got him just, the time has come, he's known about it, but now the time is right now. And he's just overwhelmed with this pressure from a human point of view. As I mentioned, McGarvey makes that point. I think the way he worded it was so good, that his humanity is in the ascendancy, meaning that everything about him human is emphasized because of the ordeal he's about to go through. Yes, sir, David.
That's verse 7. And then I had a question where it talks about that he was heard because of his godly fear,
Yes.
his prayers that he was offered.
Yeah.
Why did he pray 3 times? Does that show that it's really humanity's side?
I think it is. I believe that, and got that in the notes too, that if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Well, he knew he had to do it. But I think that's everything in Jesus from a human point of view, crying out how much he dreaded it. Similar to on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? True, quotation of Psalm 22, David being, as it were, forsaken by God to his enemies, Christ, the epitome of that, looking as if he had been forsaken. God really didn't in a literal sense, but forsook him to the point of allowing the Gentiles to crucify him. But I think both are similar in the sense that his humanity is just crying out how much he dreaded it and crying out for deliverance from it. But then at the same time, recognizing he had to undergo it.
I think also in that same verse 7, it talks about him praying with godly fear. I think that's an example of us. We need to pray with godly fear.
Yes,
also.
yes.
There's a
Nevertheless, not,
respect we should have for God.
yes, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Yes, yes, I think that's it. Amen. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, anybody else? It's time to wind it down. It just seemed like we started. Well, Lord willing, we'll go on through and answer some of our questions. But I tell you what, if you haven't read it already, read Psalm 115 through 118. And that's really kind of a commentary on how brief that little statement was in Matthew 26:30 and the other accounts, that they sang a hymn and went out. And if they were true to the Jewish traditional observance of the Passover, it was not just anything they wanted. It was the last of these Hallel psalms, which picture the rejection of the Messiah. It's a beautiful picture. Comment, question on that? Anybody? David?
Hey,
Yeah.
anytime.
What's
I
that?
have one more question. Where it talks about watching and praying that they may not enter into temptation. What about, what's involved in watching and praying, I guess?
Yeah.
Is that just a more focused on spiritual things?
I think it is, and then, you know, they were, it would be right after this that the temple guards would come, and they're going to take Jesus. And that's when Peter, you know, cuts off Malchus' ear, and then they scatter, exactly like you said they would. And you watch and pray. I think it's almost reminding them of the need of this because of the trials that they will have that were impending. Yeah. Oh, don't you sometimes think, boy, and we don't know what trials are impending on us, do we? We just need to, Father, give me strength that, as the Lord said in the prayer, Matthew 6, pray after this manner, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Help us to have power to overcome it. And that's a lesson on yourself, isn't it, obviously? Anything else?
And in those John chapters that we've been 13 through 17 that we just finished, all through there several times, it refers to, or he specifically says, I know where I'm going, I know where I'm going. This kept on being in my mind today when I was reviewing. And he does know where he's going. He's assured he's going back to the Father, but it's still troublesome.
It is still, yeah.
Major troubles.
We can have all the confidence in the world, in heaven and God, and still difficulties come that try our souls. We have the confidence that overrides it, but still we've got to deal with it. Yeah. Okay.